evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute on National Affairs, I'd like to welcome you to our lecture tonight. The topic of the Institute's week-long symposium is Art in America Today, a Public Matter. Before introducing our guest speaker, I'd like to invite you to participate in the various activities which will be going on tomorrow. From 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., Mary Weisgram will be demonstrating pottery in the North Lobby of Carver Hall. At 12 noon, here in the Memorial Union, there will be a film documentary on Claus Oldenburg. And at 8 p.m., John Cowenhoven will be speaking. He is the author of Made in America. Tonight, we have the privilege to hear the very distinguished Harold Rosenberger speak. Mr. Rosenberger has been and is perhaps the most important figure in explaining the various art movements to have emerged since World War II. He is a tremendous influence in the art world, and not without good reason. His knowledge of art is vast, his perception sharp, and his approach to art holistic and objective. Mr. Rosenberg is both a critic and an educator. Besides serving as the art critic for the New Yorker magazine, he has written a number of books. To name a few among many, he has written The Anxious Object, Art on the Edge, and Willem de Kooning. He has two books which are coming out in spring, and one is on Barnett Newman, and the other one is Saul Goldstein.
Saul Steinberg.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't get all that.
Okay. Saul Steinberg.
I'm getting all the Jewish names.
Currently, Mr. Rosenberg is professor at the Department of Art at the University of Chicago. So without any further mispronunciations, it's a pleasure and an honor to present to you Mr. Rosenberg.
Thank you very much. The subject I was asked to speak about is a very complicated one, but I see you're all very complicated people, so it won't bother you to deal with a complicated subject. Briefly, it's to talk about criticism, and many, of course, believe the less said about criticism, the better, but there is a lot to be said about it. Now, I'm going to talk about three types of criticism. One is criticism that regards works of art as objects. The second is criticism that regards works of art as ideas. And the third is criticism that regards works of art as creative acts. Now, usually these are not separated, and in writing about any particular artist, one would not break this down, say what are his objects like, and what are his ideas like, what are his creative acts like. But to talk about criticism in general, I think it's rewarding to make this distinction. Now, there could be other kinds of criticism. I didn't happen to think of them when I was making the notes for this talk. The first type, that is criticism of works of art as objects, is the ideal concept of criticism as far as the public is concerned. The public expects a critic to walk up to a painting and say, well, how good is that painting? And of course, the word "how good" has several meanings too. The question is it good in relation to the art of the past? is it good in relation to the art of the future? Is it the best thing we have around now, even though what we have around now maybe not be very good? That's one kind of connotation of how good is that object. Another connotation, more important perhaps to the public, is how good is it going to look to my friends if I buy it, or if I like it. If I say, well, I like that painting, how am I going to look? This is, you might say, an urgent matter. You see, there's how good is this painting? There's a third matter, which is of course even more urgent, which is how much is it worth in cash? How much is it worth now in relation to the price that I would have to pay to acquire it? And how am I going to make out if I buy it? Is it going to go up in value? Is it going to be a recognized work? Is it something that will turn me into a multimillionaire, or is it just another painting? You know, these are all questions of how good it is. And the public would like the critic to advise it on this subject. I say this from experience. I mean, having talked to groups about values in art, I find it normal for somebody to say, well, what's good now? See, what would you advise us to acquire at this time? Where is the Jackson Pollock of 1978? If you were around in 1945, you could have bought a Jackson Pollock for $300. Now that painting has been sold, let's say, for $100,000, and one painting that was bought for $800 has been sold for $3 million. Now that's criticism. When you buy a painting for $800 and sell it to the National Gallery for $3 million, then we know you're a good critic. Now, what are you going to do for us now? This is 1978. Where's the Jackson Pollock of our time? But the only answer to that is you're not interested in art, you want to make money. This is not, however, an accusation. There's no reason in the world why people shouldn't make money in any way that there's money to be made. But nevertheless, this is the kind of criticism which regards the work of art as an object, wants it to be evaluated as if you were taking a bucket of dirt to the assessor's office in the good old Western days. Say, how much gold is in this dirt, see? I don't see any reason why the public shouldn't ask the critic to do that. The only trouble is it won't be satisfied. When I, for example, look at TV and I see some pundits of basketball sitting around making predictions about who's going to win the next game, or in football, who's going to win the Super Bowl, I think, gee, those guys are real critics, because they go over every single member of the teams and they reach a judgment and they predict who's going to win. Or you have programs in which you have Wall Street experts called in, and they say, well, now, Joe, tell me what's going to be good in 1978. And the expert says, oil, it's going to be good. Electronics, terrific. And I say, well, that's criticism. Could I say that? What kind of painting is going to be good in 1978? The only thing is I then remember that they made predictions like this before and the oil stocks went down and so on. In other words, all the experts are in a similar boat. And if they were not, there wouldn't be any stock markets and there wouldn't be any art markets. All those experts would go out and acquire all the good things for themselves, and that would be the end of the gamble. So, as it turns out, there are no reliable critics of objects anywhere. The only thing that we do know in that regard, and I want to make the point to you that every Sunday newspaper in the United States has an art reviewer who presumes to make this kind of judgment. He tells you this is a good painting, this is a good sculpture, and this other one is not, you know, and it's all on the basis of evaluating works as objects. You don't get any analysis of the nature of the work, what it means, how it fits into our society or into modern culture generally. It just tells you this is good and that's bad. Now, one thing I think we do know fairly well, by we I mean me, what I know fairly well is bad work. I'm very good at seeing when works have been overvalued. I get very, what shall I say, sure of myself when I see certain artists, their works that have been praised to the heavens by the great majority or consensus of critics, and I suddenly get the feeling that this stuff is not what we are told it is, and then I'm very sure of it. But there's no way of making money on negative judgments. You see, in the stock market, they have something called selling short. If you think that General Motors is going to drop 30 points within the next 6 months, you can sell General Motors instead of buying it. And if it drops 20 points, you will collect as much as if you bought it and went up 20 points. The art world, there's no selling short. You cannot, when an artist is overvalued, say, I will deliver him to you at that price 20 years from now. And they don't have any such a system. So as a result, being a critic of what is not very good in art produces no practical results. You only do this for the purpose of, you might say, rectifying the cultural balance and giving other artists a better chance. Because if you get too many fixed ideas about art, and they tend to be devoted to praising bad artists, all the other artists suffer from this. They feel that there's some kind of conspiracy going on. They become discouraged. They don't have a feeling of enlightenment, and so it's a bad thing. So we do this out of, what shall we say, general love of mankind. That is, we try to rectify the balance when there have been too many bad artists praised. And that, again, has to do with regarding art as objects. Well, I can move from that into the next category, which was regarding art as ideas. And this is somewhat more important, because if bad ideas get around and are admired in any given culture, it becomes extremely bad for that culture. You could almost say it's even bad for the state. If people have awful ideas about what is attractive, what's valuable, what's significant, you have a very bad social situation. And we can, of course, exemplify this by totalitarian art, which is an art that is enforced on people's taste, whether they like it or not. If they like something else, they're regarded with suspicion. We have now an enormous history of this. It goes back to about 1928 in the Soviet Union. It covers the history of art in Nazi Germany and in fascist Italy. It has some reference to what's regarded as art in China today. This becomes an enormously important thing. People often wonder, why do the Russians get so heated up if somebody paints an abstract picture? After all, what will an abstract picture do? The very fact that it's abstract means that it's not saying anything very concrete. And if it doesn't say anything concrete, why get excited about it? You know, I mean, you can understand that the Czechoslovakian government could get very heated up when Dubček was permitting all kinds of satirical movies to be made. And some of those movies were rough stuff. They really made very pointed comedy out of communist ideas. And in fact, when I first saw some of those movies at the film festivals, my immediate reaction was, this isn't going to go on. They can't swallow this. If they swallow this, then they're not there anymore. You know, either you're there or it's there, but they can't be there together. There's no way in which a communist regime could swallow those comical movies. And of course, what happened was that finally they saw some of the movies, and that was the end of Mr. Dubček. I mean, they moved in with tanks and did away with the movies. And it was all they were doing away with, by the way. Nobody said anything else. They just made some movies. The poets and the writers and the artists just trying to say what they thought, and that became a revolution. It was suppressed. No more of those comical Czechoslovakian movies, you see. Well, why should the Russians get excited about abstract art? And the answer is that art can be an extremely vital thing if it shows up in a new form. That is to say, the Russians have decided long ago, back in 1926 or 28, no more of this experimental business. You know, you paint interesting subjects from the point of view of the regime, and that's what makes you into an artist. If you're not doing that, maybe you can go out and work in clay or in some pottery factory, but if you paint pictures, yet. So they stopped it. Okay. The Nazis were even worse. I mean, they stopped everybody. They didn't even care what they painted. You could be stopped because you were a member of a certain group. So you see, art can get extremely important insofar as it is taken to reflect ideas. It does reflect ideas. It comes up with all kinds of notions, and the criticism involved has to do with explicating those ideas. And as art becomes more and more complicated, or as we say, avant-garde, is to say that it uses ideas that are not familiar to everybody, the matter of criticism, dealing with art in terms of ideas, becomes more and more widespread. Most of the articles that you'll find in art magazines deal with art in terms of ideas, which the artist either has explicitly described as being at the bottom of his work, or which the critic finds is the genuine meaning and significance of his work. I've no objection to dealing with art in terms of ideas, it's a question of how far you can go. That is, to what degree can art be nothing but ideas? We now have, of course, examples developed in the last 15 years where art has been construed to consist entirely of ideas, as in the case of course of conceptual art. The critic in that case enters into a dialogue with the artist, since there is no work of art, and they, you might say, keep a constantly changing image of something which doesn't have to be too precisely defined, going. There's an activity going on, and it has to do with art insofar as there's a total concern with the question. This has often happened in modern times. That the concern with the question of art has tended to eliminate the art itself. It's not surprising in view of the, as I said, intense complication of problems of art, particularly when they are discussed as problems. You can make a problem out of almost anything. We know, for example, the last few years we've had problems of the edge of the painting. What should be at the edge of a painting? What should be on the side of the edge? If you have a canvas and it goes over the stretcher, usually the artist used to leave that blank because that's where the frame would go. But when paintings stopped having frames, then you stopped having that white part necessarily covered with a frame, so you could have an enormous seminar on what should go on the outside edge of the canvas, you know? And some people have thought that was the ultimate question. I mean, never mind what's on the canvas, what goes on the edge or on the outside of it. We've had all that stuff. Nobody is going to write a great comedy about the history of art in the 20th century. Nobody is that detached from these questions who knows anything about them. In other words, there are people who think they're funny, but they don't know anything about them. There are people who know something about them who can't bring themselves to think that they're that funny. So we're not going to have any Aristophanes of modern art, which is too bad, because the whole development would be justified if it resulted in an Aristophanes. But since it has not resulted in an Aristophanes, we will sit around and talk about it. Now let's see what else I have to tell you. I can't see what's written on these cards anyway. Now we've just been talking about the tendency of art to go so far as to reduce itself to ideas, that is to at least regard the work as secondary to the motive of the work. That's what we find, say, minimal painting, minimal sculpture, which I gather you've had some experience with the other day. And of course, this is all, as I say, a great intellectual value, but one tries to somehow, in a kind of instinctive way, to prevent art from being reduced exclusively to ideas. That is, we still have an old habit, which may be on its way out, of regarding the work of art as something to look at. And so we like to say, well, what qualities does it have besides representing this or that brilliant idea? You know? And this leads us to the third type of criticism that I was talking about, that is to say, regarding works of art as creative acts. As somebody did this. They didn't just think it. They also did it. And they did it in a certain way which nobody else ever did, or if they did something like it, they didn't do it in exactly the same way. So, in other words, the work of art, from this point of view, strikes the critic as a unique thing, a creation by one man who somehow got around to doing this. In other words, Leonardo said art is an intellectual thing, but he didn't say it was only an intellectual thing. And he spent a lot of time watching how winds blew and what visual manifestations there were of the passage of birds and all sorts of stuff like that, which is not really much of an idea when you get right down to it. I mean, it's a study of phenomena in the real world, and the way in which you can, by taking a pencil or a piece of charcoal, reproduce that activity on a piece of paper, or at least create an equivalent of it that will be recognized and will have some kind of meaning. So that if art is an intellectual thing, it's a thing that's not like other intellectual things. That is, it's not like a formula in mathematics or a rule in law or any other intellectual construct of humanity. It has its own character. And what is characteristic of it is that it's the product of a hand as well as of a brain. That is, an artist is somebody who uses a tool which is an extension of his 5 fingers. And this has always been a characteristic of art up till conceptualism. No matter what you do, even if you draw simple straight lines, it's different from somebody else's straight line. You might say that with an artist, up to a certain point, he thinks. But beyond that, his hand takes over and he begins to do it. And at that point, that he loses touch with other people who might have exactly the same idea. This turns up always in art movements. The people who belong to those movements may share some very basic concepts with one another, and they may regard them as enormously important. But as the movement develops into an art movement, as opposed to a polemical movement, the hands of the art members assert themselves and they do different work. You know that from surrealism, futurism, all the even constructivism and the Bauhaus. You have people with very firm rules of how things should be done, and yet every time somebody else did it, it turned out to be different. So the hand plays its part in the thinking of the artist. Now, this is a rather mysterious idea, I suppose, although in a way commonplace, that a hand thinks. It's something that we all have experienced in different ways. Well, let's say your rear end thinks when you're riding a bicycle. When you first start to ride the bicycle, it doesn't think very well, so you usually fall off the bicycle. But after a while, the organism adjusts itself to thinking as if it had two wheels between its legs, and then you find yourself riding around on a bicycle. You know, these kind of, you might say, dynamic miracles have to do with art. I remember when I was a kid reading in a history book about Louis XIV, and it said Louis XIV was as graceful at the billiard table as he was on the throne. And that gave me some terrific idea about art. You know, I thought, Louis XIV, he's playing billiards now. He's got some kind of a touch here, which is Louis XIV, you know. So billiards gives you a lot to think about in relation to art, because you gotta, you can be good or bad, but there's a certain way in which Louis XIV did it that nobody else did. Made him into an artist at the billiard table. At any rate, this is what I'm talking about when a critic regards the work of an artist as a creative act. He gets involved in terrific mysteries. Well, that Jackson Pollock, for example, said that when he was inside his canvas, he thought of nothing. Well, some people get very angry when they hear that, you know. They say, well, what the hell do you mean? There was nothing in his mind when he was inside the canvas. First of all, what is he doing inside of a canvas? And secondly, we know that he went from one painting to another. They all have some kind of resemblance to each other, so he must have thought of something. Or if he didn't think of something, he was a sort of obsessive lunatic, so what are we getting excited about? Nevertheless, any artist knows what Pollock is talking about. It meant that he finally, after a certain point was reached, threw himself into doing this, and the doing surpassed any idea that he had about it. Now, artists have always done that, but nobody, you might say, ever had the privilege before the Americans following World War II to go the whole hog with just painting without knowing what they were painting. And so they did it. And apparently it suggested itself as extremely meaningful and beautiful to a great many people, and so it became a thing in art. It swept around the world. Why? Well, one could talk about this why for hours. What caused art to lose the definitions which inhibited people from, to use Pollock's term, entering into a canvas and just splashing paint around? I mean, what happened in the world that made this possible? This is the history of our culture, this question. You might say that the work of Pollock and the action painters of America in the 50s has the most enormous significance. We haven't begun to develop a theory of it. We find it difficult enough to stay with it as a fact, because in art, as in other fields, there are always people who want to change something new into something familiar and show that that is not anything to get excited about, you know? I once listened to a scientist talking on the anniversary of Descartes, who explained that in science the same thing takes place all the time. He said, as soon as somebody gets a new idea in science, the first reaction to it of the academies is to say, this is nothing. It has nothing to do with science, and therefore we're not going to bother with it. After a while, a certain amount of circulation is developed around this idea, and to make a long story short, finally the idea is accepted by everybody. At this point, the Academy announces, we knew this all along. There's nothing new about this idea. This is exactly what we were talking about all along. What's there to get excited about? Well, the same thing goes on in art all the time. You know, you do away with anything new in order to maintain the comfort of those in charge. And that's true about the hand, too. You see, once the hand became so interesting with the abstract expressionists, we began to find that a lot of people have been talking about it for many years. For example, let's say, I had a quotation here from Henri Faucillon, who is an old art historian, a Frenchman, who wrote an article called In Praise of Hands, in which he makes the following eloquent statement. The most delicate harmonies, evoking the secret springs of our imagination and sensibility, take form by the hand's action as it works in matter. Now that's a perfectly good description of abstract expression. However, he was talking about Hokusai, and the description is perfectly applicable to Hokusai. Now, I don't know, well, he wrote that 30 years before the action painters, so it's not a new idea, but it took on, and has taken on, some extremely, you might say, vigorous and conflicting notions in criticism. For example, the hand today in art is a very strong matter of controversy because Duchamp, who is antecedent of many current artists, attacked this idea that the work of art is a creation of the hand and appeals to our sensibility. He said, I'm sick of this art that's so beautiful and so suave. I'm interested in an art of ideas, and therefore I don't want any fingerprints on it. I don't want any massage. I don't want anything smooth. I don't want anything, any brush strokes. So he made that famous work of his out of glass. So it shouldn't show any marks, shouldn't have any indications of temperament. And there are many artists, the minimalists, post-constructivists, who take this view that the work of art ought to be kept clean of any indications of the artist's personality. Let it be a clear-cut idea. On the other hand, there are artists who feel just the opposite. Now, say we're talking about critical values, it's very difficult to reconcile these two views. That it is very hard to say, for a critic to say, I am both for the hand and against it. The subject has been reduced to a standoff. And you will find, if you look through the art of the last 20, 25 years, that there is a very strong division precisely on this basis. How much should the body of the artist show in his work? To what degree is his personality of interest to the viewer? And in contrast, shouldn't we concentrate on his statements in whatever form he chooses to present them? In other words, the critic has to take a stand somewhere. Pro-hand, anti-hand. An issue of sensibility. Now, there are many critics who don't believe this. They don't believe that it's necessary to make a choice. They usually belong to my second category, people who approach art as ideas. I'm sure all of you are familiar with art critics who are prepared for anything. Show them any work of art and they'll explain to you what it's about. And accompanying that explanation is implied assent that is very good. We find that especially in the big newspapers. The New York Times is split. It has one critic for whom everything is very good, another critic who's always ready to put a knife into something, and that way they achieve what you might call cultural balance. Doesn't solve any problems for criticism, but it does apparently satisfy the New York Times. Most of the art magazines are filled with articles that have discovered ways of explicating new works. That is to say, the criticism consists of showing that you know how it came about and what is thought about it. And this is, of course, highly educational. That is, nobody needs to be in the dark about anything that's produced. On the other hand, if you're talking about art as representing an act of creation, it immediately becomes obvious that some acts of creation are more magnificent than others, and that in fact some acts considered as acts of creation are not creative at all. I mean, they're just repetitive of some old ideas or rationally worked out variations on somebody else's work. And from that point of view, you become involved in polemics. You don't just explain everything that comes along and say, well, this is terrific. Which leads me to what is perhaps my last point. That is that criticism, insofar as it regards works of art as creative, becomes itself a creative activity. That is to say, the critic is not able to say with any degree of assurance, this creative act goes just like this. You don't see creative acts around, you sort of smell them. And when you see a work and you admire it greatly, you think how marvelous the procedure, whatever it was that produced this image. And so, as Baudelaire said, it's possible to criticize a work of art by writing a sonnet about it. That's what he had in mind. You look at a work of art, you see a creative act, and you get filled with enthusiasm, and so you want to convey that vision which you saw in the work, and that is a kind of criticism too, which we could call creative criticism. Baudelaire had another formula. He said that the critic must be naive. Now, this is exactly the opposite, of course, what you think the critic ought to be. I mean, how can a critic be naive? I mean, he goes around looking at everybody's work, and he reads books, and he does all. To be naive would be an enormous task. And furthermore, Baudelaire was the most sophisticated man of the 19th century, is an odd fellow to be promoting naivete anyway. So he must mean something else by it than we normally have in mind. And what he really meant is to get rid of preconceptions. You become naive when you confront something without knowing what it is. The artist, in confronting his canvas, if he's a good artist, doesn't know how it's going to come out, even if he's got a model on a stand or a bowl of apples or whatever it is. He doesn't know how it's going to come out, and the critic, when he looks at that work and is prepared to write something about it, doesn't know either how it's going to come out. And that's what I think Baudelaire meant by naive. That is, he meant that there had to be a kind of conviction that there's something there that you want to discover, something that you want to formulate. And when you want to do that, you always find yourself starting from scratch. You could have written 100 essays on painting or on painters, and you go into a gallery and you look at some new work, and you don't know any more about it than you did the first time you ever looked at a painting. It's all there for the first time, and you are propelled into naivete. Now, this is not true about reviewers. They always know what it is they're looking at, and they always know how good or bad it is. But when a critic walks into a work, an exhibition, he doesn't know whether it's any good or not, and very often he's likely to walk out again and keep quiet because nothing has occurred to him. Now, of course, if you work on a newspaper, this is not acceptable. And I've infuriated some people who are very nice people by pointing out that reviewing art is an impossible job. She's a journalist student, that's why I'm looking at her that threatening manner. It's impossible to be an art reviewer. You can't, in New York, go around at 20 galleries in 1 week and know what you're looking at. It's absolutely impossible. I defy anybody to do it. It's a complete fraud. There's no way of doing it, unless I happen to be particularly stupid, which would mean that if they can do in 5 minutes what takes me 3 years. I don't believe it. I don't believe I'm that stupid or that these guys are so smart. And when I read what they write, I know that they're not very smart. So you have to make it up. It's a creative act on the part of a critic. You go into a gallery, you look at a work, something strikes you about it, you begin thinking, what is it that struck me about it? You go through this whole process. It takes a long time. Or sometimes nothing happens. You go in, you look at paintings, nothing happens. They're just hanging on the wall. What are you going to do? If you have to write copy, you make up some kind of notion about, maybe it's no good or something like that. I would think that most reviewers are predisposed to think that the work is no good because they really don't want to write about it, and it's torturing them because that they have to deal with it, so they say it's no good. I don't blame them. You know, it's like you have to write about your enemies. Anyway, Baudelaire had this kind of a job. He used to write for the newspapers about the salon, and he needed the money. In the 19th century, most art criticism was written by poets and novelists who needed the money. now it's getting to be a profession of some sort. But in the old days, it was an activity of literary men who were broke. And since they were poets, they thought they had some relation to imagery. After all, a poet writes in images, and images appear on canvases or on plaster, so a poet felt that he could write about art, and that's how he became an art critic. That prevailed up till the 20th century, but then we began to get, really serious art critics. Now, Baudelaire had this kind of a job, and he didn't like it very much because, I say, being a naive critic, he had to spend all his time on each of these paintings that he wrote about. So he tells somewhere that he thought the best thing would be if he could make up a system. And when he went into the salon, his system would make it possible for him to arrange everything in a proper category. It would also tell him whether he liked it or not. And then he could dash through the salon, make some notes, and he'd be all set. Said he found it was not practical. Why wasn't it practical? He said, well, first of all, this system never fit any real works of art. It was a perfectly good system until he looked at paintings, and the system didn't work. And furthermore, he said the system began to bore him to death the moment he finished working it out. So he didn't like the idea of having it around as something to play with, so he said it was no use. He had to go back to the same old business of regarding each work from scratch as if he saw it for the first time, was writing for the first time, and that was what he had to do, as tiring and as exhausting as it was. In other words, the critic begins in a new ignorance before each new painting. A new painting provides him with a new ignorance, which he then has to overcome and make his way into understanding it for the first time. So that finally it's a kind of experimental activity in which the critic is trying to grasp a work of art just as anybody else tries to grasp a work of art. He has maybe a more ambitious idea of what it means to grasp a work of art, maybe a lot of equipment which could or could not be used, but the ultimate, you might say, the ultimate truth of criticism is that it is the same kind of activity that every one of you engages in to some degree when he sees a painting that interests him, or a painting that doesn't interest him. If he's interested and wants to write something about it, he goes through the same process of bewilderment that I'm sure each of you has experienced in looking at works of art. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rosenberg will answer questions now for about 10 minutes if you'd like to ask some.